Hello, friends. My name is Jennifer Long, and I currently serve at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Corning, New York. I'm joined by two colleagues this morning. One is Reverend Roger Behrens, who is joining me he pastors at Bethany Lutheran Church in Elmira, New York. So that's the next town over from me. And then our friend from far, far, far away is Reverend Steve Langford, and he is retired from active ministry in the United Methodist Church and an author and coach in his own right. So it is good for us to be together. We've been looking at Exodus 20 is the first 4 weeks of a summer series. This is week 2, and it's paired with a text from Matthew. So we're going to start with the reading of the text we'll be considering this morning.
Thank you, Jen. This reading comes from Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through verses 11 from the New Revised Standard Version of our Bible. Wonderful beginning to the series here regarding this piece of God, who God is in our life. So let's follow along. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. And remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it.
The gospel lesson is from Matthew chapter 22, where Jesus and the Pharisees discuss which is the greatest, that is the most important commandment. Matthew 22, verse 34. Now, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. The word of God.
Thanks be to God.
Word of life. So there's a lot in there.
Yeah, I think these first 3 commandments that are here, if you will, that I read, really speak to that greatest commandment that Steve shared with us, right? Summarizing the 10 commandments into the 2 of loving God, loving neighbor.
I thought it was interesting that this went 3 to 11. You know, there's no other gods, no idols. Do not make wrongful use of the Lord's. I always hear that is don't take the Lord's name in vain. I mean, that's what I grew up hearing from parents and Sunday school teachers. And then remember the Sabbath. And I would have to look to see who divides it as which ways. But one of the ways I often taught this to confirmands was that the first 4 commandments speak to us about relationship to God, and the 6 that come after speak to us about relationship to each other. So I don't know for sure that the narrative lectionary people did that for that reason, but not everybody divides them in the same way. I want to say the way I understand commandments as 1 to 10 is not quite, as a somebody who grew up UCC, is not quite the same as how the Lutherans count them.
Yeah.
The division that you've described is the one that I'm most familiar with. So the 4 that we focus on today talk about how to relate to God or to Yahweh the Lord. And we need to remember the context that here are people who are just being introduced to a relationship with this God. They've been brought out of slavery through Moses at the command of this God. And now that they're at Mount Sinai, the Lord has proposed to enter a covenant with them. And so here he's saying, so if you're going to walk in covenant with me, this is what it looks like. And the thing, you shall have no other gods before me or besides me, comes in the context of a culture that had many gods. And so he says, I call for an exclusive relationship.
I've often thought of that in current terms as what are the things that are stand-ins for God in my human life. You know, what are the things that I would think of myself as worshiping, whether it is a style of life or a particular thing, or I've also tried to think of, are there things that get in the way of me spending time with God? And are those things, you know, to some extent, other things I worship?
Another way I've heard that, Jen, is what do I look to give me what only God can give me? Yeah. Where do I seek my identity rather than in God? My sense of security rather than in God. In other words, we look to other things to provide what only God can really provide.
Yeah, we looked at things, you know, our social status at the upcoming party or gathering, right? Who we rub elbows with, our financial ability to go run off and play golf for 3 days. You know, what are
this confession?
Yeah. So sorry about that. Yes. But yeah, you know, what kind of car we drive, you know, it's fitting so much so. And I think when we fail and we're really focused on this first table that focuses on God in our lives. And I think about how your reading in Matthew there, Steve, brought up the love of neighbors. But if we're not focused fully on God, how are we wronging our neighbors? Or how do we fall short in caring for our neighbors because we're missing that piece, that love of God?
I really appreciated, Steve, what did you say? The mention of looking to something for a need that only God can fill.
Yes.
My other wondering of that is how conscious is that? How often does that happen in me without me even noticing?
Well, our culture trains us that if we want to belong, we need to do this. If we want to have value, we need to do this.
Well, I guess I'm wondering too, like I think it might be a useful spiritual discipline to what does it take for me to get the time and space to reflect on I mean, I just think if it's automatic in me, trained by culture, whatever, how do I get clear on that automatic and begin to look for what might be deeper or what might, you know, I'm thinking of all sorts of theological metaphors, what might feed me more?
Yeah. So we have to come up against an option before we can consider it. Otherwise, we just automatically default to what we've been trained.
I also love the question about, is this confession? Only because it popped another question of mine was, do idols lead us to confession eventually?
Do idols what?
Do idols lead us to confession? Or would it be do recognized idols lead us to confession? Just lots of,
yeah.
I think part of,
well,
go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I think, Jen, that's always going to, because if we're failing or falling short in carrying out these commandments here in the first table surrounding God, that puts us in a sinful approach. And I think we need to come back to God. But in doing that, we also need to recognize where we fell short and confess that shortfall,
I think
which
it's
is confession.
yeah, I think it's so easy for me to look at this as a checklist and be like, I did this, okay, I've got it all good, so I'm good in God's eyes, as opposed to, I can't remember, I was on retreat and this text was looked at, and one of the invitations was not as a checklist. Don't like study it to death. What's it mean to dwell within those words? And I don't know that I have a complete answer, but I feel some of like, this is what this conversation is doing, that it's more than just a checklist to be completed. And it's more about how do these words become a part of me, a part of my life and a part of how I live.
Years ago, I had a friend, a mentor, who said, if you want to understand these commandments, take the negative and translate it into a positive. You shall have no other gods. Means let God be God.
I'm stealing that for Sunday.
Well, yeah.
That is a wonderful.
Yeah. Well, hey, I stole
way to look at this.
Yeah. And the thing about idols, we in our culture probably don't understand this, but an idol was a way of interacting with the god, and it was a way of trying to gain the god's favor. I'm going to bring this sacrifice to the idol. So it's a way of trying to have some kind of control and power over God, to manipulate God. And so I don't know, how do you translate that into a positive? Live by faith, trust God.
Yeah.
And this is a curiosity. I have no kind of historical background or anything, but it makes me wonder too, by the time they're in the Exodus, there was a way that they worshiped. There was a place that they worshiped. By the time they're in the wilderness, there is no place like that.
Yeah.
And how does that shift what and how you think about offering to God and what an idol? I don't know. I'm gonna have to play with that some more.
So I just ran across this morning what Luther wrote in the Large Catechism about this. And I'm going to shorten this a little bit, but a God means that from which we are to expect all good and to which we are to take refuge in all distress. That now I say upon which you set your heart and put your trust is properly your God. So think about how easily we can get caught up in the distracting idols that exist around us, because society, as Steve said, leads us that way.
Yeah.
But we must return to the true God.
Does that actually say take refuge?
Yes.
For me,
Yes.
That's another beautiful question. How do you enter this in as not a tech checklist? What would it mean to take refuge in these words?
What is this?
Wow.
So what is this saying about God? This is saying we don't have to try to manipulate God, because we can trust this guy. He brought us out of slavery. What else will God do for us?
And taking refuge, I think that kind of alludes to the fact that God already realizes that we're going to step away. We're going to fall. We're going to fail. But when we return, when we're distressed or down on our life, God is going to embrace us nonetheless. Always.
Do you guys, either of you know the hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing?
Sure.
Yeah.
So that is one of my favorites. And what I love about it are just, they're lines in two different stanzas. And the first one is, Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. That reminds me that Jesus, that Jesus comes for me. That the neighbor that is asked about in Matthew is also me, and is everybody. And the one that's just after that is prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. And I just know that to be true in my own life. I'm not always getting it.
Yeah. And I think what part of what's underneath this, by the way, Jen, that's one of my favorite lines, prone to wander. And that strikes in me this sense that we expect ourselves not to wander, not to fail, as Roger's talking about. And what this is saying is God understands that. I love the way the psalmist says it in Psalm 103, for he remembers that we are dust. God doesn't have the high expectations we do. And so God is saying, come on, relate to me. I'll take you where you are as you are without judgment or condemnation.
What I hear you saying is I should lower my expectations.
I haven't written this blog yet, but it's on my to-do list. Perfection is only a word in the dictionary. Yet how much does it drive us?
Yeah.
I made a reference in a sermon once and was stopped after service by a teacher and was really deeply touched. I talked about progress, not perfection.
Yes.
That our call is not, and she said, we use this in our classroom all the time.
Yeah.
Wow.
See, we as humans are always in process. So the issue is how much progress are we making in the process? Not how are we measuring up?
I also think, and I can't tell you which number psalm it is. I can tell you it's marked in the Bible. I could flip through it till I found it. But I was very appreciative in verse 6 of the Exodus reading, the mention of steadfast love, because one of the things that I carry with me in terms is God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. God is slow to anger and this not only says that, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
So God abounds, overflows in this kind of unfailing love that never gives up to the 1,000th generation, which is in the English language is to the nth degree.
Nth degree.
And also more than what, there are other places biblically that talk about the sins being visited on the generations that follow, but I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think any of them go to the 1,000th generation.
No,
that love goes deeper than all that other stuff.
Yeah, and that's the contrast. It says the visiting to iniquity to the 3rd and 4th generation, but God's faithful love is to the 1,000th. So which one's greater? The impact of our sin or God's faithful love? Yeah. I love the term Richard Rohr uses. He talks about we get obsessed with sin management. And as long as we're talking about sin, we're keeping the focus on us. And it blinds us to who God is and to this God of bounteous, generous, lavish love that never abandons us or gives up on us.
That's an interesting thought, Steve. So when you think about society today and you listen to the news, you watch what's going on in the world, we have gotten so immersed in the negative. And that is so feeding the world. That's all we seem to look for.
Yep.
Is more of the negative when we should be looking towards God.
Yep.
In the positive.
So, Steve, sin management, was it versus something else? Did you have something that was, or was it, were you just talking about we're too focused on sin management as opposed to what else? What would you be focused on instead?
Sin management keeps the focus on us. And so we come up with a man-centered Christianity. It's about me, as opposed to a God-centered Christianity in which we fall in love with who God is and God's ways. So sin management blinds us to God. Even the evangelical theology that says that Jesus died for my sins, the focus is on whom? What he did for me, as opposed to seeing in that the steadfast love of God that refuses to give up on us or abandon us. How far will God go in loving us?
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of and I know I've said this here before, but Martin Marty's response when asked, "Have you been saved?" Is every morning, which is not the focus on I am saved from my sins, but that is something that happens each day upon rising. I mean, I just think it's a different focus.
Yep.
And I hadn't, I mean, I considered it, I've often thought about that as a better answer. I've used it when asked. I'm happy to steal his words, they're great. But I hadn't thought of how it shifts focus from the individual to something bigger.
My response is, I am being saved from my sin. There's still some of it there, but God's working on it. And this term, the steadfast love of God, in which God abounds, that's what Paul picks up on in Romans 8 and says, nothing can separate us from the love of God. God's love never gives up on us. God never abandons us. Nothing can separate us. Which challenges, going back to sin management, challenges that theory that our sin separates us from God.
And also that makes, in my opinion, this text so much bigger than a little plaque I hang on my wall that says they're commandments, not suggestions. That's not enough. It's not enough to look at the text without really entering into it, dwelling in it, exploring it. It's just not enough.
Well, see this, because we call them commandments, it appeals to that sense of we've got to do something to get God to love us. To
earn that grace.
Yep, it's about how we measure up, as opposed to this is about God, and what does it tell us about God's grace? About who God is.
But isn't it, also to add to that, I think, God, I think we get on with our daily lives and we get busy. I'm headed to Binghamton, right? I'm on a mission, right? And we forget that God is walking with us on that mission. God's grace intruded into human existence through Jesus Christ, and it's not a one-time event.
No,
God has been with us all throughout.
And
I think. Go ahead, Jen. I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, and I don't know that there's enough time to explore it, but I have often noticed in my own life clear recognition of God's presence at the things that I have been most joyful about, and clear recognition of God's presence at the things that have been heart-wrenching, but often less recognition during the stuff that falls in between. And how does this text invite me to cultivate that?
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Roger.
No, I was going to say one more thing from Luther. He had a statement in there about our relationship and communication with God puts us in connection with the saints that's gone before us. Yeah. And I don't remember how he actually said that, but think about that person in your life that you were able to talk to and find peace with outside of maybe your relationship with God. And now that person is gone from your life. But I really feel as though this love of God connection with us every day maintains connection with my grandfather, a person that was so powerful and meaningful to me. So, and he would help me through those difficult times at a young age in my life. And I still feel his presence in my life today through God.
Yeah. Mom's dad or dad's dad?
That was dad's dad. You would have never guessed that, Miss Systems.
I'm just curious.
So, Jen, playing off of your comment about in the everyday life, that goes back to what Jesus identified as the great commandment, the Shema. Every day they prayed that. They started their day And what it was saying is the essence of life is found in loving God.
And I may be remembering my rituals incorrectly, but isn't that what's rolled up inside a mezuzah? If you are part of a Jewish household, you have a mezuzah. Usually it's a little metal box, and inside what's rolled up is the Shema.
Shema.
That's what's in
Deuteronomy 4:6 and
Yep.
following. Yeah.
Yep. Oh,
So
wow.
what would happen if, rather than doing this checklist of behaviors, we put the focus on what would it be like to love God? To love God with that kind of intensity.
What would it be like to love God with that kind of intensity and know at the same time that God knows me and loves me well enough that on the days when I can't make it there, that I am no less a child of God?
Yep.
Sorry, just kind of playing with.
So this love that we are to have is a response to the love that God has for us.
All right, we've gone over the timer. I shut it off like 5 minutes ago. I'm sorry, but rich conversation for which I am very grateful. Did we decide who was going to pray us out when we started? Because I can't remember already. Yay! Thank you, Steve.
That would be
Brother
me.
Steve.
So let's pray together. And so we find ourselves, merciful God, God of steadfast love to the 1,000th generation. We find ourselves saying, thank you for who you are. Thank you for who we are as you have claimed us as your own. And we pray that you would help us to fall in love with you, that we would love you as passionately as you love us, is our prayer in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Peace,
Thanks,
friends.
Steve. Thanks, Jen.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Steve.